Hello and welcome to Sound Strategic. I'm Meia Nouwens, Senior Fellow for Chinese Security and Defense Policy and host of the IISS Sound Strategic podcast. In today's episode, we discuss the recently concluded second IISS Prague Defence Summit, which was held in Prague from 3 to 5 September. We'll cover the keynote address by NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte on NATO's priorities and investments and the challenges that the alliance currently faces. We'll also discuss how sustainable the current momentum is in European defense spending growth and what policy options countries have open to them to continue implementing increases, including, for example, the potential role to mobilize the private sector to invest in defense. Lastly, we'll discuss the EU perspective, including the latest changes to EU policy in support of defense, as well as remaining challenges. Joining me today to reflect on the second IISS Prague Defence Summit are three IISS experts. Dr. Ben Schreer, Executive Director of IISS Europe and Director of Defense, Technology and Future Conflict. Fenella McGerty, Senior Fellow for Defense Economics, and Ester Sabatino, Research Associate for Defense and Military Analysis. Ben, Fenella, Ester, welcome onto the show. Ben, starting with you, you played a leading role in organizing this second Prague Defense Summit. What were the main key takeaways from the keynote speech delivered by Secretary General Mark Rutte in his speech at the summit?
It was an excellent speech. The audience was very much taken with his presentation, but also with the Q&A. For me, there were a couple of key takeaways from his speech. The first one was that he made a very strong point about a joint Russian-China axis, Russia and China cooperating together, including in the military domain. The second point that I took away from his speech was a major call for even more investments in European defense capabilities, and his call for European leaders to really now go on and make the tough choices in order to produce and procure much faster. The last point that I took away from his speech was that Europe could and should learn also from what Ukraine is doing, not just on the battlefield, but also what Ukraine is doing in terms of significantly ramping up defense production. And lastly, for me, what he underscored was that it is all there for Europe in terms of its economic capacity, in terms of its defense industrial capacity. The ingredients are all there. At one point, he said, look, Russia basically has the GDP of Texas, but outproduces Europe at the moment. How can that be? Europe needs to make conscious decisions and capitalize and actually implement all the things it wants to achieve.
Could you maybe talk a little bit about what stood out to you from the rest of the panels?
Yeah, I think some of his sentiments were carried over and repeated in one way or another. I mean, all European speakers stressed the need and the urgency for Europe to step up, stressed the urgency to implement all the ambitions. I think there was a strong realization across all the panels, at least where European representatives spoke, that some positive steps have been taken, that there is a positive momentum, but they also all stressed that a lot of work is still to be done. You know, the political choices have to be made, red tape in bureaucracies have to be cut. Quite a few leaders also stressed that, unfortunately, there are different threat perceptions across NATO allied countries. Therefore, there are also different priorities still. So it's not quite clear where that European leadership is coming. I think what was also interesting in terms of the panel speeches, there was quite a few speakers who pointed to the opportunities for cooperation with other nations, particularly Ukraine, but also the IIP4, Australia, New Zealand, South Korea, and Japan. And also we had Turkey for the first time on the panel, who delivered an offer for more cooperation with the European allies going forward. The underlying sentiment in a lot of those panel speeches, however, was that open question whether the momentum for greater European defense will and can be maintained in the long run.
You mentioned the IP4. What is the relevance of these non-EU, non-US partners for European defense?
On the one hand, they are extremely relevant because now the Indo-Pacific theater and the European theater are increasingly intertwined. And we're not just seeing this in the fact that North Korea has been sending troops to fight in Ukraine, but also, as I mentioned before, much closer Sino-Russian strategic relationship across the board. But they're also increasingly important because of their capacity to plug some of those defense capability gaps rather quickly. So in the case of the ROK, providing Poland with much needed armor relatively quickly. In the case of Israel, providing European countries with much needed air defense systems at a relatively short notice. What we saw in Prague was an interesting conversation that we're having now. The question where the long-term relationship with these countries will be going to in the defense industrial space. Was this just a temporary spike in defense cooperation to plug gaps quickly, or will we really see the development of very long-term defense industrial relationships that go beyond plugging just holes? And that's also where I think interesting conversations with Japan, with Australia, beyond the RK is coming in.
Thanks, Ben. I think that's a perfect moment to hand over to Fenella to talk a little bit more about the new ways of funding and supporting European defense. Fenella, how sustainable is the current momentum in European defense spending growth?
Thanks, Meia. I think, yes, there was a lot of talk at the summit about the increased level of investment in defence across Europe and what this might enable in terms of European defence capability and capacity. And it's true, we are in a very strong growth period at the moment. We've had a raft of budgetary revisions across Europe in 2025. So we're seeing regional defence spending growth set to nearly match the record growth of 13% in real terms that we saw in 2024. And Europe is now in its 11th consecutive year of real terms increases for defence. I think there were several speakers that highlighted the sustainability of this momentum is not guaranteed. There are issues and difficulties out there that might constrain the policy options open for countries. I think reaching this goal, as we've seen, NATO members in the region agree to the 3.5% of GDP on defence by 2035. That's going to require robust legislative creativity, and it's going to mean difficult prioritisation choices. We saw several speakers mention that the high level of debt facing several countries. We saw the Swedish Defence Minister, Paul Johnson, mention it in the first plenary, and the Czech Deputy Finance Minister, Mora, also discuss it in the final plenary on financing defence. And I think if countries do delay increases because of this extended fiscal position or because of other political barriers that is restraining further investment, then you could risk up to 1.3 trillion in lost investment over the next decade if countries delay increases to getting to the 3.5%.
What policy options do you think countries have open to them at the moment to continue implementing increases?
I think in light of these concerns about the affordability of further increases, several countries are examining various mechanisms and policy options. There's been adjustment of fiscal rules to allow increased borrowing and debt in countries that are able to do so Germany and Sweden, for instance. We've seen more countries establish off-budget defence funds paid for by bonds and loans, and a discussion about other initiatives across Europe that might enable this kind of funding as well. Beyond that, we're looking at increased taxation and implementing cuts to other areas of public spending, as countries like France and the UK are now contending with. And finally, the mobilisation of the potential of private sector financing is also being considered, but it's likely to be a combination of all of these elements. I think we've seen a raft of initiatives announced in 2025 by the European Commission, but also from NATO itself. What was really interesting for me in the final plenary on the new ways of financing defence was that we heard from the European Investment Bank Vice President Robert de Groot about the increased investment that the EIB is making in defence across Europe and how they're opening up investment and ensuring that more entities that fall under defence or the dual use aspect are receiving this funding. They're seeing potentially more and more of the volume of lending that EIB can make, increasing even more over the next period. So I think that's really interesting. The initiatives from the EIB have had an impact, which another speaker on that panel mentioned as well. At the country level, we are seeing countries make these initiatives and make use of the greater funding flexibility afforded to them. But it will ultimately depend upon how fiscally extended they are and the level of political will within the countries to make these increases for defence, because things are very fiscally constrained across the region.
Thinking a little bit more specifically in terms of the private sector, what role or potential is there at the moment in mobilizing private sector investment in defence?
We have seen several initiatives launched in 2025 to bolster both private and public investment, but quite often we hear that the success is going to depend on these shifting attitudes in countries, how meaningful and targeted these increases for defence are, and whether procurement reform and industrial support is going to be effective enough to ensure that these increases are effectively spent. quite often, and it came up quite a lot in Prague, that defence industry needs long-term plans, annual funding commitments, long-term orders, and then they are then able to invest with confidence and respond to increases in demand. And we have seen a gradual easing of exclusionary policies to open up more capital and investment opportunities to defence, but the extent to which they will make a difference will depend on take-up and attitude and the shifts therein. We're still seeing some concerns around ESG being one of the several barriers to financing startups and SMEs that defence face. We're also finding that governments are needing to address the underlying architecture and procurement framework to ensure that these financing opportunities are accessible. That said, we have seen venture capital investment in European defence startups intensify. We've seen valuations increase across Europe in 2025 alone. We're still lagging behind the more mature US market, and there is a prevalence of US investment in European defence innovation. So it's a question of how to engage with European venture capital and private equity to encourage that investment in regional defence. And I think in the financing plenary of the Prague Defence Summit, we heard from Sebastian von Ribbentrop, the founding partner of Join Capital, and he spoke about the progress in European defence investment and the initiatives that have been enacted so far, mentioning the NATO, European Commission, but still found that despite this progress, the region still lacks the procurement speed. It seems to be the key issue because these companies are often quite small. They don't have the underlying capital to withstand a lengthy procurement process. So that seems to still be the main ask from industry in terms of encouraging private investment in defence.
Staying on the topic of procurement, Esther, can you give a sense of what the main changes have been to procurement in Europe that we've seen?
Thank you, Meia. Yeah, so also in this year, as we analyzed for the previous years, we saw there has been some very stronger focus on investing more in defense equipment. And as Fenella was just saying, also to try to do that in a faster way. And as we mentioned in the report, around Europe, there have been some efforts along different lines to change and adapt the national structures to the defense procurement, but also to solve those administrative red tapes that Ben was referring to that actually really do slow down the procurement efforts. But these efforts also included activities to install a different sort of relationship with the industrial sector, and also when it comes to the international cooperation, to try to find ways to cooperate differently among Europeans, but also with international partners. On this, I would say that some examples include the revision of procurement structures, for example, in all the 3 Baltic countries. The different procurement offices of the different branches of the armed forces were consolidated into a single national structure that speeds up the process of procurement. In other cases, some other administrative procedures require the parliament to approve the procurement of a specific equipment. And as it was in the case of Norway, for example, there was a revision of the cap that is necessary to have to then activate this approval by the national parliament. And so all these legalistic approaches are going to change and to affect the way that procurement is going to be done in the future at the European level. There have been also attempts to work around these procedures and to do it faster through mechanisms such as, for example, government-to-government agreements that have increased quite substantially in last periods. And also to change the type of the relationship between the government and the industry, both at the national and international or intergovernmental level. And an example of this can be seen in different European countries. There is one French initiative specifically on the Defense Aerial Drone Pact that puts together defense primes together with small, medium-sized enterprises to work specifically on technology types and technological advancements to create sort of clusters to speed up the development of new technologies. Or as it is in the case of Germany, there are some other frameworks, for instance, agreements between the government and the defense companies to issue framework agreements that can be used also by other countries to increase the level of procurement done cooperatively with other European partners.
Esther, you've given me a fantastic opportunity to plug the report that you referred to, which was a really great piece of work that was launched at the summit, the IISS Strategic Dossier on Progress and Shortfalls in Europe's Defence, that can be downloaded in its entirety from the IISS website. But maybe one last question, Esther. How is the EU supporting the efforts that you were just referring to? A lot of them are member state initiatives or at the national level. How is the EU playing a role in all of this?
The EU changed quite substantially its approach to supporting European countries to increase the level of procurement that is done cooperatively. It has been doing so since the last couple of years, but particularly since the start of the war in Ukraine. I would say that lately the major tangible examples of how the EU is supporting this sort of cooperation can be seen in several projects. One example of this is the Common Armored Vehicle System project. And that was initially a trilateral initiative between Finland, Estonia, and Latvia. Now it includes 7 European countries, including non-EU countries, for instance, the UK and Norway, that very recently joined the initiative. And this cooperation also receives EU fundings that stem from the EDIRPA initiative of last year. When it comes to facilitating the way that legislation can support common procurement, the EU started its way towards the so-called Defence Readiness Omnibus, which is a set of legislative initiatives to simplify the way that regulations work and apply at member state level. What I would say is probably going to have a stronger impact in the short to mid-term is the Security Action for Europe initiative. That is expected to substantially support the common procurement from the European defence industry and to scale up the production, thanks to 150 billion euro in loans that will be assigned to the member states already as early as 2026. But on SAFE, it has to be said that this is an instrument that comes with specific requirements. For instance, it does not allow to acquire products with a design authority or 35% of the total cost of the systems that come from outside of the Union, although some specific agreements may soften these limits. But these sort of requirements or limitations, if you want to call it, in that way, they need to be counterbalanced with the trend that Ben was referring to and that was also mentioned and seen at Prague, meaning the fact that non-EU countries are investing and being present at the European level when it comes to defense industry.
That's all we have time for today. So thank you, Ben, Fenella, Esther, for sharing your insights. And thank you all for listening. We hope you enjoyed the episode. You can find more information on the topics discussed in today's episode in our show notes. And if you haven't already downloaded your copy of the accompanying IISS strategic dossier to the Prague Defence Summit, entitled Progress and Shortfalls in Europe's Defence, you can access the publication for free on the IISS website at iiss.org. Please do follow, rate, and subscribe to Sound Strategic wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts to keep up to date with all the latest episodes. Thank you and see you next time.